It was not that the crime itself was more bloody than many that come under the notice of the police. London has seen worse upon the river and in its darker purlieus. It was the circumstance, simple, sharply defined, and yet apparently impossible, that fixed it in Watson's memory. A man was struck down in the heart of the Temple Quarter, within sight of two respectable witnesses, and almost under the nose of a constable, and yet no human agency could upon the face of it be discovered. The body lay there in the pool of lamplight, but the hand that had wielded the weapon had left behind neither footprint nor weapon, nor even, as one imaginative reporter put it, so much as a shadow. The tragedy occurred on an evening in late October, when the first raw touch of winter was beginning to creep into the London air. A thin, persistent fog had rolled up from the river and spread itself in grey streaks among the courts and alleys that lie between Fleet Street and the Embankment. The gas lamps showed as blurred halos, each surrounded by a dim nimbus of yellow light, and the cobbles gleamed faintly with moisture. It was a night on which honest men hurried home with collars turned up, and those whose business lay in the streets went about it with a certain dogged resignation. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Mr. Archibald Pritchard, a young clerk in the chambers of Messrs. Fenton and Risley, barristers at law, descended the stone steps that led from the office door into Chancery Lane. He was a pale, earnest-faced fellow of 25, with ink stains upon his fingers and an anxious habit of glancing over his shoulder as though a docket of overdue work pursued him into the street. He paused for a moment at the foot of the steps, drawing on his gloves and looking up and down the lane. To his left, the great thoroughfare of Fleet Street roared faintly through the fog. To his right, the lane ran away into dimness, marked at intervals by the smudged glow of the lamps. Directly opposite, the entrance to one of the Temple courts opened like a darker square cut into the general murk, a black mouth that seemed to drink in the scanty light. It was at this moment that Mr. Pritchard became aware of a solitary figure walking slowly toward him along the pavement, coming from the direction of Fleet Street. The man walked under the lamps, his tall, spare outline clear against the mist. As he approached, Pritchard could see the gleam of a white collar, the shine of a silk hat, and the swing of a cloak that fell almost to the man's heels. There was nothing in the stranger's appearance to excite remark. Indeed, he might have been any professional man returning late from his club or chambers. What first attracted Pritchard's attention, and what he was later to repeat with unwavering insistence, was the curious distinctness with which the man's shadow was thrown upon the wet pavement. The gas lamp some yards behind him cast his figure forward in a long, black shape that wavered and trembled upon the stones, keeping pace with him as he advanced. "I remember thinking," Pritchard said afterwards, "that he looked like a picture cut out of black paper, so sharp was the outline of him and his shadow together." Pritchard watched idly as the stranger came on. The lane was otherwise empty. Not a footstep sounded but his own. No other figure moved in that dim corridor of stone and fog vapour. The clerk was about to turn toward Fleet Street when a second sound caught his ear, a brisk tapping upon stone, irregular, as of a stick or some metal object striking against the wall within the entrance of the Temple Court. He turned his head sharply. From where he stood, the view into the court was limited. The black archway framed only a short segment of the open space beyond, and the fog lay there more thickly. Yet he could distinguish a patch of lighter ground where the court widened, and in the centre of that patch a dull glimmer of reflected lamplight. He saw nothing moving there. Only the vague suggestion of railings and the outline of a stone water trough. Tap, tap, scrape. The sound seemed to come from somewhere just within the entrance, as though someone stood there in the deeper shadow, fumbling against the wall. Pritchard stared for a moment longer, but neither sight nor sound resolved into anything definite. When he looked back to the pavement of Chancery Lane, the solitary gentleman was almost opposite him, his features clearing in the light. Pritchard saw a thin, clean-shaven face with a hooked nose and deep-set eyes. The man's expression was abstracted, as of one turning over some legal problem in his mind, and his gaze was directed slightly upward, not at the clerk before him. Pritchard, a nervous but polite young man, stepped back a pace to let him pass. The stranger's shadow slid across the pavement, lengthening and shortening as he moved. For an instant it lay like a black pool at Pritchard's feet, and then was drawn away again. It was afterwards that the clerk tried to fix the exact sequence of impressions in his mind. At the time, he merely registered them without conscious effort. He noticed, for example, that the man's boots were narrow and well polished, that they fell noiselessly on the stones despite the quiet of the lane, and that there was a faint scent about him, something brisk and foreign, like eau de cologne. The tapping sound from the court ceased abruptly as the stranger drew level with the archway. Pritchard could not have said why, but he held his breath for a moment listening. The man in the cloak paused just for a fraction of a second, and his head turned a little in the direction of the dark entrance. It was a motion so slight that it might have been no more than the stir of the air in the lane. Yet, in later recollection, it stood out for Pritchard with a strange, exaggerated importance. Then the man walked on. He had taken, perhaps, half a dozen more strides when it happened. There was no warning cry, no scuffle, no rush of feet. Pritchard, whose eyes had again wandered toward Fleet Street, was suddenly aware of a queer, strangled sound behind him, a sort of thick gasp, as of a man struck unexpectedly. He spun round. The solitary gentleman had halted beneath the next lamp, some 20 yards away. For a second he swayed where he stood, his hands clutching at the air. His hat toppled from his head and rolled noiselessly along the pavement. Then, with shocking abruptness, he pitched forward on his face and lay utterly still. His cloak spread about him like a dark pool on the grey stones. Pritchard stared in frozen horror. There was no other human being in sight. The length of Chancery Lane, as far as the fog allowed him to see, was empty. No door had opened, no figure darted into an alley. The entrance to the Temple Court was a black, unchanging square in the wall. It was then that the clerk's paralysis broke. He rushed toward the fallen man, shouting wildly for the police. "Hi! Constable! Murder! Help! In the Lord's name!" His cries echoed from the stone facades. A window went up somewhere above. A woman's frightened voice exclaimed, "What is it?" The sound of boots came clattering from the Fleet Street end of the lane, and a moment later a uniformed constable loomed out of the fog, truncheon in hand. "What's this noise?" he demanded sharply, and then, catching sight of the dark shape on the pavement, "Here now!" Together they bent over the prostrate figure. The man lay on his face, his arms flung wide. Pritchard, with trembling hands, turned him over. The collar of the cloak fell back, revealing a shirt front already darkening with a dreadful stain. "Good Lord," whispered the clerk, "he's been stabbed." The constable struck a match, shielding it with his gloved hand from the faint drift of the fog. In the unsteady light, the dead man's features showed clearly. The aquiline nose, the somewhat sunken cheeks, the iron-grey hair at the temples. His eyes stared up, glassy and unseeing, at the blurred circle of the nearest gas lamp. There was no sign of a knife. "Stand back, if you please, sir," said the constable, his professional manner returning with an effort. "We mustn't have the place trample over. You'll be Mr. Archibald Pritchard, from Fenton and Risley's, I dare say. I've seen you pass along here of an evening." Yes, yes, stammered the clerk. I saw him fall. I was there by the steps. He pointed with a shaking hand. He was walking alone, officer. I swear it. There was no one near him. The constable's eyes narrowed. He turned slowly, taking in the empty lane, the closed doors, the dark archway of the Temple Court. From somewhere distant came the rattle of a cab and the muffled laughter of revellers on Fleet Street. The fog thickened and thinned, moving in faint, ghostly coils across the scene. "We'll have the station called at once," he said. "And the doctor, and you'll stay where you are, Mr. Pritchard, for I'll want your statement. There's more than a gentleman in a faint here. I'm thinking." Within 10 minutes, the place was alive with movement. Another constable appeared, then a sergeant, and behind them a small knot of curious onlookers who had scented the presence of tragedy as hawks scent blood. They were held at a distance, muttering and craning their necks. A medical man, fetched from a nearby surgery, knelt by the dead man and made a brief, grim examination. "Quite dead," he announced. "The knife has gone in under the left shoulder blade, piercing the heart. Whoever struck the blow knew very well where to place it." "But there was no one," cried Pritchard, his voice rising nearly to a shriek. "I saw him. He passed under the lamps, and there was not a soul within yards of him. I swear it before God." The sergeant looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment. "You saw no one approach him?" "No one following." "None. He was alone. His shadow was clear upon the pavement. If anyone had been near him, I must have seen it." "His shadow," repeated the sergeant slowly. "You're sure of that?" "Certain." Pritchard's lips quivered. "I noticed it particularly. There was just the one, his own." "No other." The sergeant exchanged a glance with the constable, who scratched his chin beneath his helmet. "Well, his shadow won't help us much," grumbled the latter. "We want the man himself." The body was searched, and papers found upon it which identified the victim as Sir Julian Ashcombe, K.C., a well-known figure at the criminal bar and a name of weight in legal and political circles. There was a murmur in the surrounding crowd as the name was passed from lip to lip. "The Home Office will be stirring over this," muttered the sergeant. "We'll have the Yard in it for certain." It was in the course of their immediate investigation that the peculiarity of the case first presented itself in a concrete form. The paving stones of that section of Chancery Lane had been recently repaired. A fine crust of white dust, the remains of sand and powdered mortar, lay upon them and upon the narrow gutter by the curb. In the light of the lamps, and more clearly still by the bull's-eye lantern which the sergeant produced, the marks of footsteps showed with startling clearness. They could trace the prints of Sir Julian's polished boots for some distance along the pavement, coming from Fleet Street, advancing under the lamps and stopping where his body lay. Here and there they were overlapped by the scuffed impressions of the constable's heavy soles and Pritchard's lighter tread. But early on the sergeant had thrust the bystanders back, so that the area immediately around the corpse remained comparatively undisturbed. Of any other footsteps, approaching from behind or crossing his path, there was no trace. "You see, sir," said the constable, straightening up and wiping his hands on his trousers. "If there'd been another gent come up close enough to stick him, we'd have his marks as clear as you please. But there's naught but Sir Julian's, and your own, and mine." The sergeant blew out his cheeks in perplexity. "He must have come up from the court there," he suggested, nodding toward the black archway. "Stepped out, gave him the blow and bolted back before anyone saw." They turned their attention to the entrance of the Temple Court. The stones there were also whitened by the same fine dust. Though trodden in places by the passage of residents and messengers, there remained enough of it to show impressions distinctly. They found the marks of boots going in and out of the court at various times, overlapping, crossing, and blurring one another. Several seemed fresh, but of a single, clear trail leading from the court to the spot where Sir Julian had fallen, and back again, there was no sign. "It's as if the man was struck down by the air itself," muttered the sergeant irritably. "There's no sense in it." From the upper window of a clerk's office opposite, a second witness was produced, a middle-aged copying clerk named Hodges, who had been working late and whose attention had been drawn by Pritchard's cries. Hodges, a slow but conscientious fellow, peered short-sightedly down into the lane, and then, in the stuffy atmosphere of the little office, gave his account. "I looked out more than once, sir, before it happened," he said. "It's a dull job, copying leases, and I often stretch my legs and stare into the street to rest my eyes. I saw the gentleman with the cloak coming along from Fleet Street. He was alone, so far as I could see. There wasn't another soul within yards of him. Did you see anyone in the court?" "No, sir, only the dark of it. The lamps don't catch the inside very well." "You'd have seen if a man had run out suddenly and struck at the gentleman." "I should think so, sir. I was looking that way when I heard the cry." "And you saw—" "Only him falling, sir. One moment he was walking, the next he flung up his hands and dropped. There was no one near him, that I'll swear to. So it fell out that, before midnight, a rumour had already begun to circulate from mouth to mouth, running along Fleet Street and through the taverns, lodging-houses and newspaper offices, of a mysterious crime in Chancery Lane, of a famous King's Counsel stabbed to the heart in an open thoroughfare with police at either end, and decent witnesses looking on, and of a murderer who, by some devil's trick, had contrived to leave behind him neither trace of his presence nor so much as the outline of his shadow under the gas lamps. By the time the morning papers were upon the streets, they had seized upon the phrase with avidity. "The murderer who left no shadow," announced one, in heavy black type. "Extraordinary crime in Chancery Lane, a barrister slain in full public view, no assassin seen," declared another. The more imaginative among them hinted darkly at supernatural agencies, at political conspiracies, and at a vendetta reaching back into Sir Julian's earlier career. But in a quiet sitting-room on the first floor of a certain house in Baker Street, the matter was approached in a fashion at once more prosaic and more formidable. It was there, on the following morning, that Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, sat cross-legged upon the sofa, the Times spread upon his knees, a long, thin plume of smoke curling up from the pipe between his lips, and his keen grey eyes half closed in that expression which Watson had long since learned to associate with the highest activity of his friend's singular mind. Across from him, at the small breakfast table, Dr. Watson was folding his own newspaper, his coffee neglected, and his toast cold, as he stared with mingled horror and fascination at the sensational headline which had first drawn his attention. "A most extraordinary affair, Holmes," he said at last. "I can make neither head nor tail of it. If these reports are accurate, it is as strange a case as ever came within our notice." Holmes made a non-committal sound deep in his throat. "My dear Watson," he murmured, "if we were to credit a tenth of what the morning press prints under the head of sensational, we should soon find ourselves in a madhouse. Still," his long fingers tapped lightly upon the edge of the paper, "still there are here one or two features which do not conform to the usual pattern of journalistic embroidery." He flicked the ash from his pipe into the grate and smiled, that thin, keen smile which always set Watson's heart beating a little faster in anticipation. "I confess," said Holmes, "that I find the idea of a murderer who casts no shadow a trifle more stimulating than the average suburban burglary. We shall, no doubt, hear more of the matter before the day is out." As if in answer to his words, There came at that instant a sharp, authoritative knock upon the door of the sitting-room. Mrs. Hudson's step sounded in the passage, and a moment later she ushered in a familiar figure in the frock-coat and bowler hat of officialdom. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered, his thin, ferret-like face more than usually eager, and his keen eyes bright with a mixture of hope and perplexity. In his hand he held a folded copy of the Morning Chronicle, its headline clearly visible. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," he said briskly. "Dr. Watson, I take it you have seen the news?" Holmes rose languidly from the sofa, his gaze already alight. "Indeed, Lestrade," said he. "Pray take a seat. You could not have chosen a more opportune moment. I perceive that the Yard has found itself confronted with a problem which is, shall we say, a shade beyond its customary experience." Lestrade gave a short, dry laugh. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I'll not deny that it's a puzzler," said he. "There's a man stabbed to death, witnesses all around, a clear night, fog or no fog, and yet no one seen near him, nor so much as a footprint to show how the murderer got to him or away again. We've done what we can with the ordinary methods, and it's like striking at smoke. So I've come to ask whether you'd care to take a hand in the business. For if ever there was a case cut out for your sort of work, this is it." Holmes's eyes shone. "My dear Lestrade," he said softly, "you could not have brought me a more welcome invitation. Tell me everything from the beginning." And so it was that the impossible crime in Chancery Lane, which London already whispered of as the work of a shadowless murderer, was laid before the one man in England most fitted to unravel its secrets. Lestrade seated himself on the chair near the hearth, laying his folded newspaper across his knee, and for a moment contented himself with studying Holmes's thin, eager face. I could see that the little inspector was more than usually impressed by the problem he brought. "You have wasted no time," Holmes remarked. "The body was found a little after 9, I take it. You were upon the ground before 10, and here you are in Baker Street before 11 has struck. That argues a case which presses on your mind more heavily than the average warehouse robbery." Lestrade gave a grunt of mingled amusement and annoyance. "You're not far out, Mr. Holmes. It's 10:30 now, as you very well know, but how you fix the rest of it I'll never understand." "Your boots, Lestrade," said Holmes languidly, with a little motion of his pipe. "They show the white dust of the newly laid pavement in Chancery Lane, which I observe has adhered only to the front of the soles, not to the sides. That tells me you have walked over that particular patch only once and not loitered. The damp on your coat sleeves is from the fog that rolls up from the river by night. No fog to speak of at this hour in Baker Street. Finally, the slight smudge of blacking on your right cuff is from the constable's lantern, which you have evidently been handling yourself in the absence of better light. The conclusion is obvious." "Obvious to you, maybe," Lestrade muttered, though there was a gleam of admiration in his small eyes. "Well, you're right on every count. I came straight here from the Yard, Mr. Holmes, after being on the spot near an hour." "You have done wisely. Now let us have the official version. Spare no detail, however trifling it may appear to you. The very grain of dust that seems least significant is often that which chokes a man." Lestrade took a quick breath and launched into his narrative, which, in broad outline, matched the account we had already gleaned from the newspapers. Holmes listened with his head thrown back, his eyes half closed, but I knew from the faint contraction of his brows that his mind seized upon each particular. It was the clerk who raised the alarm. "Pritchard from Fenton and Risley's," Lestrade concluded. "He swears, and I'll say he seems an honest enough lad, that he saw Sir Julian walking alone, that no one was within several yards of him, and that the poor gentleman just pitched forward under the lamp as if struck by an invisible hand. Then there's the copying clerk from across the way, Hodges. He was at his window and tells much the same story. The lane empty, Sir Julian alone, then the fall. No one seen to come up, no one seen to run away. Yet the doctor is clear, a single knife thrust placed with uncommon skill, straight to the heart. And the footsteps, Holmes murmured. Sir Julian's we can trace clear enough, Lestrade replied. He'd come from the direction of Fleet Street. The pavement there has been lately relaid, and the dust shows his prints beautifully up to the very spot where he fell. There are the marks of the constable and Pritchard after that, but no other man's between. We examined the entrance to the Temple Court as well. There's dust there too, and plenty of boots going in and out at various times, but no single trail leading straight to the place and back again, such as you'd look for if a man had darted out and in to strike the blow. That's what beats us. Holmes's fingers played idly with the paper upon his knee. You have verified the times? He asked. When Sir Julian left his chambers, when he was expected elsewhere? He dined with a brother K.C. in the Strand at 7:30, said Lestrade. Left there a little after 9, saying he would walk back to his rooms in King's Bench Walk. He never reached them. There are no indications that he turned aside to call on anyone else. And his position, socially and professionally? Lestrade shrugged his narrow shoulders. He had made enemies enough at the criminal bar, like all men who do their duty. Rumour says he was to be raised to the bench before long. That might add a few more who'd not weep at his passing. But we've nothing yet to show that anyone wished him dead in particular, and still less that they'd choose to kill him like this, in the open street. Holmes opened his eyes fully and sprang to his feet with an energy that belied his former languor. Excellent, Lestrade. You have brought me all that could reasonably be expected at this stage, and there is only one thing wanting. And that is, Mr. Taft, Holmes, the scene itself. Words are good, stones are better. You will oblige me if you can place a hansom at the door within 5 minutes. Come, Watson, your hat. I foresee that your medical knowledge may be of use. As we descended the stairs together, I could not help remarking the light in my friend's eyes and the quickened set of his jaw. The air of boredom which so often hung about him like a cloak had fallen away. You are interested then, Holmes? I asked. My dear fellow, an apparently motiveless crime is in itself sufficiently engaging, he answered. But an apparently impossible crime, that is a delicacy to whet even my jaded appetite. When a man is stabbed to the heart in a public thoroughfare with witnesses and policemen in attendance, and yet no one sees the assassin approach or depart, we may be sure that the explanation when it is reached will be both simple and ingenious. Our task is merely to bridge the distance between those 2 points. Merely, I exclaimed. Holmes chuckled softly as we emerged into the street and hailed a passing hansom. The fog of the previous night had cleared, leaving the October morning sharp and pale, with a chill that set one's breath steaming. Chancery Lane, Lestrade called to the driver, swinging himself nimbly into the cab after us. We rattled off through the busy streets, the clang of hooves and wheels mingling with the cries of newsboys still shouting the latest editions. Holmes's gaze roved idly from the cab window, but I knew that little escaped him. At one point his attention fixed for an instant on a shabby genteel figure upon the pavement, a man with a bulging document case under his arm, whose frayed cuffs and gleaming hat told their own tale. A solicitor's clerk, recently dismissed, he murmured. Lestrade looked out curiously. How do you make that out, Mr. Holmes? The case and general air speak of the legal profession, said Holmes. The man's boots are old but well brushed. He clings instinctively to respectability. Yet his cuffs are frayed almost through. A man who still earns a regular wage permits himself 6-penny linen at least. Dismissal within the last month, I should say. Observe also that he passed the employment agency on the corner without glancing at the window, indicating that hope has already given place to discouragement. Lestrade laughed. Well, it's not the only dismissal in London, I'll be bound, but I'd sooner hear how you explain the killing of Sir Julian Ashcombe, if it's all the same to you. In good time, Lestrade, said Holmes. At present I have no explanation, only the conviction that such an event cannot be as it appears, and that somewhere among the facts there lurks one which your reports have not yet brought to light. We alighted near the head of Chancery Lane. The place had resumed its normal aspect, clerks hurrying, messengers darting in and out of doorways, a few barristers in wig-box and gown threading their way toward the courts, and here and there the shabby figure of some wretched client hanging about like a ghost among the granite facades. Yet there was a subdued air upon the place, as though the shadow of last night's tragedy still lay upon the stones. More than one passer-by turned to look curiously at the point where a constable stood on duty, and where a faint discoloration marked the pavement. "That is where he fell," said Lestrade, leading us forward. "We've had the body removed to the mortuary, of course. The doctor is willing to meet you there later, if you like. We've kept the constable on to see that no more trampling is done than we can help." Holmes stood quite still for a long moment, his keen gaze taking in the breadth of the lane, the relative positions of the lamps, the window from which Hodges had looked down, and the dark mouth of the Temple Court. Then, with his usual abruptness, he dropped upon one knee beside the faint stain upon the stones. "The dust has been much disturbed since last night," he remarked. "No doubt you have had your men here in force, Lestrade." "We did what we could to keep them back," the inspector protested. "Quite so. It could not be helped. Still we can see enough. Here are the fine narrow prints made by Sir Julian's boots. You have had them taken?" "Photographed and measured," said Lestrade promptly. "We're learning a thing or two from you, Mr. Holmes." "Admirable. And here, crossing them, are those of our friend the constable." "Beyond doubt, but I observe something which you have not mentioned." He moved a little to one side, indicating with a thin, outstretched finger a faint, scuffed line which ran obliquely across the pavement, at a distance of some 3 feet from the spot where the body had lain. It was barely perceptible, a mere interruption in the otherwise even film of dust. "You see it, Watson?" "Some mark of a shoe dragged sideways," I hazarded. Holmes shook his head. "Too even, too continuous for that. Besides, note how it ends abruptly at the edge of the gutter. No, this is where some long, narrow object, perhaps the end of a stick, perhaps something else, has been drawn across the stones, and the direction is from the court yonder toward the middle of the lane. Curious, is it not, Lestrade, that neither of your witnesses should have mentioned any person carrying a conspicuous stick?" "There's no mention of it in their statements," Lestrade admitted, frowning. Said Holmes. "We must not build too much upon it as yet. Come, let us take the Temple Court in its turn." We passed under the black archway into the narrower, enclosed space beyond. Here the air was colder and more still. The court opened out into a small quadrangle, with a stone trough and a row of railings, just as Pritchard had described. The flagstones underfoot bore the same white dust, though churned by many feet. Holmes's eye swept the scene swiftly. He crossed to the wall on the left-hand side of the entrance, where the stone showed faint scratches at about the height of a man's shoulder. He ran his long fingers lightly over them, and then bent to examine the base of the wall. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you observe any peculiarity here?" I knelt beside him, but for the life of me I could see nothing beyond a small, clean patch, some 6 inches in diameter, upon the stone, as though the dust had been brushed away. It appears less dusty than the rest, I ventured. Precisely. Less dusty. In a place where all gathers dust, the absence of it is of equal importance to its presence. Something has rested here recently and been removed. What manner of object, and by whom, we have yet to learn. But we are, I think, a step nearer to our murderer, who leaves no shadow. He rose, his eyes alight. "And now, Lestrade," he said, "I must talk with Mr. Archibald Pritchard and Mr. Hodges each separately and at once, for in all the world there are no two men who tell the same story in the same fashion, and it is in their differences, not their likenesses, that truth is to be found." Holmes wasted no time. With that decisive, purposeful stride of his, he led us back into the open light of Chancery Lane, where Lestrade called to the waiting constable and dispatched him to fetch the young clerk from Fenton and Risley's chambers. As we waited, Holmes moved little, yet I could sense the intensity of his concentration. His gaze travelled once more from the archway to the lamp under which Sir Julian Ashcombe had fallen, measuring, always measuring, the subtle geometry of movement and possibility. Within a few minutes the constable returned, bringing Archibald Pritchard with him. The young clerk looked pale and anxious, his manner one of a man who had slept little and dreaded much. His fingers twitched at the brim of his hat as he approached. "Mr. Pritchard," said Holmes, stepping forward with courteous formality, "I am Sherlock Holmes. You need not be alarmed. My interest is in truth, not in assigning blame. I ask only that you recount your observations exactly as they occurred, with no embellishment, no attempt to supply what you did not, in fact, perceive." The young man nodded, swallowing hard. I shall do my best, sir." "You were standing on the steps of your office when Sir Julian came into view?" "Yes, sir. I had just locked the door and was drawing on my gloves." "And the lane was empty?" "As empty as you see it now," Pritchard replied, glancing about nervously. "There was not a soul beside myself until that gentleman came walking from Fleet Street." "You observed his appearance clearly?" "Quite clearly, sir. He was tall, with a cloak, and walked briskly. The fog was thicker last night, but the lamps made his outline sharp. I remember his shadow most distinctly." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Ah, yes, the shadow. You remarked upon it to the police." Pritchard's hands tightened upon his hat. "It struck me because it was so very clear on the pavement. I cannot say why I noticed it, only that I did." "You did not observe any other shadow? None thrown from the court, for instance?" "No, sir, only Sir Julian's." "And the tapping sound from the court. Describe it again." Pritchard took a long breath. "It was faint, sir. A tap or scrape, as of something striking the wall. 3 times, I believe, but irregular." Holmes inclined his head. "Irregular, not rhythmic, not steady. Good. And when the sound ceased?" "That was when Sir Julian came level with the archway. It was as though—" The clerk hesitated, visibly struggling to articulate the impression. "As though whoever made the noise realized he was being observed." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "You noticed no movement, no figure withdrawing into the court?" "No, sir. The fog hid everything beyond a few yards." A silence followed. Holmes, instead of pressing further, turned abruptly to Lestrade. "I should like to speak with Mr. Hodges now, and Mr. Pritchard, do remain in the vicinity. I may have further questions." Then, with a faint smile, "Your observations have been more valuable than you imagine?" Pritchard managed a grateful nod before stepping aside. Lestrade, without delay, led us across the lane and up a narrow staircase to the clerk's office, where Hodges spent his evenings. The room was cramped, smelling faintly of ink and lamp oil. Hodges himself, a stooped, bespectacled man, rose from his high stool as we entered. Holmes greeted him with the same courteous tone he had used with Pritchard. Mr. Hodges, I thank you for receiving us. I should like you to tell me in your own words precisely what you saw and heard last night. The copying clerk adjusted his spectacles. I had been working late, sir, a lease overdue. I stood up to stretch and happened to glance out the window. That was when I first saw the gentleman. Did you recognize him? I cannot say that I did, sir. Only that he walked alone and seemed deep in thought. And the lane, empty? As empty as it ever is at that hour, Hodges replied. I remember thinking it odd, for even with the fog one generally sees some passer-by. And when Sir Julian reached the lamp beneath your window? That was when the cry was heard. Or rather, he corrected himself carefully, I heard a sound, a gasp, sudden and sharp. I leaned forward directly, and the gentleman fell, as though struck down by an unseen blow. You saw no figure near him? None, sir. I should certainly have seen had anyone approached him openly. There were no shadows but his own. Holmes's fingers steepled before him.
No shadows but his own. You are certain? As certain as a man may be. The lamps cast directly downward. Anything crossing the pavement must have left a trace. Holmes seemed to absorb this thoughtfully before he spoke again. One more question, Mr. Hodges. At any point, either before the fall or after, did you notice movement in the Temple Court? A shape? A shifting of the fog? Anything at all? Hodges frowned. Then his features shifted with the faintest uncertainty. There was something, he admitted slowly. Just before the fall, only for a moment. A faint disturbance in the fog near the archway. As though something passed through it, though I saw no person. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Ah, my thanks, Mr. Hodges. You have provided a most useful detail. When we stepped back into the lane, Holmes drew a deep breath.
His gaze sweeping the space once more. Lestrade looked at him expectantly. Well, Mr. Holmes, you have now heard both accounts. Do you make anything of them? I make a great deal, though not yet enough, Holmes answered softly. Each man has given us a piece of a truth obscured by distance, by fog, and by the natural unreliability of the human eye. Pritchard hears a tapping inside the court. Hodges sees a ripple in the fog at the very moment that sound ceases. Both observe Sir Julian's shadow plainly, yet neither sees that of another man. One must ask, how could an assailant be present and yet cast no shadow? Lestrade snorted. That's just what puzzles us, unless he were a ghost, and I'll not believe that. Nor I, Holmes replied. But the absence of a shadow is not in itself supernatural. It is a question of angles of light, obstruction, and of concealment. The murderer may have lacked a shadow, not because he cast none, but because the witnesses were positioned such that his shadow lay where no one could see it. And where would that be? Lestrade demanded. Holmes glanced toward the archway. Inside the court, perhaps, or behind some object, or, most intriguingly, beneath something. He stepped forward abruptly, kneeling once more beside the faint scuffed line he had noted earlier. This mark is no accident, he murmured. It may prove trivial, but I do not think so. Something was drawn across the pavement from the court toward this very lamp. Something slender, narrow, and handled with precision. Lestrade looked baffled. A rope? Too thin, too smooth, Holmes said, but I shall know soon enough. For the first time that morning, he straightened and looked directly at us both, his expression taut with anticipation. We have gathered all we can here for the moment. Our next step is to visit the mortuary and examine Sir Julian's body. I must judge the angle of the wound and its depth, and from that infer the height, strength, and position of the attacker. Only then shall we know whether the impossible
is indeed impossible. He turned, his coat swirling behind him as he strode toward the waiting hansom. "Come, Watson," Lestrade. "The dead man will speak yet, and we must listen closely if we hope to hear the truth." The mortuary lay a short distance from the Old Bailey, a sombre brick building whose narrow windows admitted little daylight even at noon. By the time our hansom drew up before it,
the pale sun had climbed high enough to cast weak glimmers upon the wet pavements, but inside the air remained chill and heavy with the faint, metallic scent peculiar to such places. A uniformed attendant recognized Lestrade at once and ushered us into the examination room where Sir Julian Ashcombe's body lay beneath a white sheet. Holmes approached the table with a stillness that contrasted sharply with his earlier energy. When he investigated a corpse, it was always with a peculiar reverence, as though the body itself were a final witness whose testimony, however silent, bore weight and meaning. Lestrade folded his arms. "The doctor will join us shortly, but you're welcome to begin, Mr. Holmes. Nothing has been disturbed since last night." Holmes gave a brief nod and lifted the sheet to expose Sir Julian's torso. The wound was just as Lestrade had described, a single, narrow puncture beneath the left shoulder blade, scarcely larger than the diameter of a pencil, yet unmistakably fatal. The dried blood around it had darkened, and the skin was already taking on a greyish pallor. "A clean, deliberate thrust," Holmes murmured. "The work of someone who knows anatomy tolerably well. Observe, Watson, the angle is downward, slightly oblique." I leaned closer, noting with professional interest the depth and direction. "The blade entered from above and from the rear," I said. "The killer must have stood behind him, perhaps elevated by several inches." Holmes's eyes flickered with approval. "Just so. Now consider the implications. If the blow came from behind and above, the assailant must have approached at close quarters."
No thrown weapon could yield such precision. He was nearer than any witness believed. Lestrade scratched his chin. "That's just the point. No one saw a soul within arm's reach of him. That merely tells us the witness's angle of view was insufficient. Not that the attacker was absent," Holmes replied. "The human eye is notoriously narrow in its scope, especially when distracted or framed by fog." Hodges looked downward through a window. Pritchard stood behind Sir Julian and slightly to the side. Both would have seen any figure approaching from the open lane, but not one emerging from a position shielded by architectural constraints. "You think the murderer came from the court?" Lestrade said slowly. "I think it nearly inevitable," Holmes answered. "But how he came from the court, struck his blow,
"And retreated unseen, that is what interests me." He covered the body again and turned away, pacing the length of the room. "The angle of the wound suggests the attacker's arm moved downward. A man of average height, striking downward at another man's back, must be standing quite close. Yet no one saw even the murderer's shadow. If the lamps cast Sir Julian's shadow so sharply, why not his killer's?" I could not prevent the question rising. "Unless the killer stood outside the lamp's range." "Precisely," Holmes said. "He may have struck from within a boundary of light that concealed him rather than revealed him. Shadows are not only cast, they are also swallowed." Before Lestrade or I could ask what he meant, the door opened and the mortuary physician entered, a stout man with spectacles and a courteous manner. He greeted Lestrade, nodded solemnly to Holmes and confirmed our observations. "Yes, the blow was delivered with considerable knowledge," he said. "A long, thin blade, perhaps a stiletto or a sharpened bodkin, driven with force into the intercostal space. Instantaneous death." Holmes questioned him briefly about the likely height of the attacker, to which the physician replied that the angle suggested someone either slightly taller than Sir Julian or positioned higher by several inches. Holmes thanked him and turned back to us with renewed intensity. We have learned what we can from the body. Now let us consider motive. Lestrade, you mention nothing yet pointing to a particular enemy. Nothing concrete, said the inspector. But Sir Julian had his share of contentious cases. There's talk he received a threatening letter last month.
Though nothing was found on his person. A letter? Holmes's interest sharpened instantly. Who reported this? One of his clerks. They said Sir Julian tore it up and dismissed it as nonsense. Holmes paused a moment, his eyes narrowing. You will obtain that clerk's testimony for me at once. Such trifles are rarely trifles. He strode toward the door, but halted as though struck by an afterthought. There is another matter. Sir Julian was walking toward King's Bench Walk, yet he chose Chancery Lane, a route slightly out of his way. Is that typical of him? Lestrade looked surprised. I hadn't considered it. Most barristers take Carey Street or the Strand End. Just so, Holmes said quietly. He chose a narrower, less travelled path on a foggy night. Curious for a man of regular habits. I ventured a thought. Perhaps he wished to avoid someone on the main road. Or meet someone, Holmes added, willingly or otherwise. Gentlemen, our next inquiries lie within Sir Julian's chambers, his papers, his correspondence, his engagements. There will be something there that ties his final movements to the scene of his death. The handsome ride from the mortuary to King's Bench Walk was brisk, but Holmes remained silent the entire way, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the pattern of fog drifting past the window. Only when we arrived at the quiet, dignified row of chambers did he stir. Inside Sir Julian's rooms we found his senior clerk and several solicitors who had worked with him. They greeted us gravely, for the atmosphere of shock had not yet lifted. Holmes's questions came swift and precise.
Had Sir Julian been troubled of late? Had he quarrelled with anyone? Had he mentioned an appointment on the night of his death? The answers were uncertain. Sir Julian had seemed preoccupied for several weeks, though he hid it well. A few remembered overhearing raised voices during a private meeting the previous Monday, but no one knew with whom. His personal correspondence had been locked in a drawer that now stood open for our inspection. Holmes sifted through papers with practised swiftness, pausing only when a half-burned scrap caught his attention. He held it to the light. The fragment bore only part of a sentence, cannot be allowed to continue. But even that small portion seemed to ignite something within him. There was a threat, Holmes said softly, and Sir Julian attempted to destroy it, but not thoroughly enough. Lestrade leaned forward. Do you think it's linked to the murder? I think, Holmes replied, folding the scrap carefully, that every thread we have touched so far, his unusual route home, the tapping in the court, the vanished assailant, the missing shadow, and now this, he tapped the fragment, points toward an intelligence both careful and desperate. He stepped toward the window, gazing across the quiet courtyard of the temple. And if I'm not mistaken, he continued in a lower voice, the murderer has already made one miscalculation. A very slight one, but enough. Lestrade stared. What miscalculation? Holmes turned sharply, his eyes alight with purpose. The murderer believed he could act unseen, but nothing in London is unseen, not to the right observer.
We're in the right place. He reached for his hat. We must return to Chancery Lane at once. There is one more detail I must verify, and if it is as I suspect, we shall have our first glimpse, however faint, of the man who casts no shadow. Holmes's insistence that we return immediately to Chancery Lane left Lestrade visibly puzzled, yet he followed without protest. I had travelled with Holmes too long not to recognise the quiet resonance in his voice. that particular timbre, which signalled he had glimpsed a thread invisible to others and meant to seize it before it slipped away. The hansom had scarcely stopped before Holmes stepped out and strode toward the familiar stretch of pavement beneath the gas lamp where Sir Julian had fallen. The fog had thinned since morning, but a faint, milky haze still clung to the narrow lane.
Holmes paused beneath the lamp, his eyes travelling from the ground to the iron fixture overhead, then to the walls on either side. "Watson," he said abruptly, "stand here, precisely upon this cobble. Yes, just there. Face the lamp." I obeyed, with Lestrade watching us warily. "Do you observe your shadow?" Holmes asked. I looked down and saw a clear outline of my figure cast sharply upon the damp stones. "Distinctly? Now move 2 paces toward the court." I did so, and the shadow lengthened, sliding at an angle across the pavement, distorted but still recognizable. Holmes stepped forward. "And now 2 paces more." I did as directed, and suddenly felt a faint thrill run through me. My shadow no longer stretched before me. It had vanished altogether. "Well?" Holmes prompted. I glanced down, bewildered. "Holmes, there is no shadow at all." Lestrade stared at the stones, then at Holmes. "How in blazes?" Holmes pointed upward. "Observe the lamp's angle. Its light strikes full upon Watson in his first position, but once he enters the boundary of light, cast by the second lamp farther down the lane, the shadows overlap and cancel one another. Any object standing where Watson now stands produces no discernible shadow to a viewer positioned either where Pritchard stood or at the window above." Lestrade frowned. "But then, if the killer were standing exactly there—" "Exactly," Holmes finished. "He would appear to cast no shadow, and if Sir Julian passed before him by a mere yard or two, the witnesses would see only the victim's shadow, not that of the man who struck the blow." Lestrade blinked. "That explains the shadow. But it doesn't explain how the murderer got there without anyone seeing him." "For that," Holmes replied, "we must return once more to the tapping sound Pritchard heard, and the faint disturbance seen by Hodges. Both coincide with Sir Julian drawing level with the court. Now consider the mark I showed you this morning, the thin, smooth scuff drawn from the court toward this very lamp." "You think the murderer dragged something?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that he may have positioned himself with unusual ingenuity. A man cannot melt into shadows, but a man can lower himself from above." "From above?" Lestrade echoed. Holmes stepped back beneath the archway of the Temple Court. The shadowed stone walls rose steeply on either side, forming a narrow throat between buildings. Holmes tilted his head upward. "You see that ledge, Watson? There, 3 feet above the arch, and the drain pipe beside it. A man could stand upon that ledge with ease. If he braced himself against the pipe, he might even remain there for several minutes without detection." Lestrade stared upward, incredulous. "Are you suggesting the murderer was perched above the archway like some great bird of prey?" "Something of the sort," Holmes answered calmly. "And when Sir Julian approached, the tapping Pritchard heard may have been the murderer adjusting his footing or his support." "But how did he descend without being seen?" Lestrade challenged. Holmes gestured to the scuffed line across the pavement. "He may have lowered himself with the assistance of a rope, cane, or other device, one end braced against the wall, the other against the stones. And the scuff we saw could easily have been made by such an object sliding as he steadied himself." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "And he dropped down behind Sir Julian, struck the blow and pulled himself back into the court before anyone saw?" "Not quite." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "If he dropped from that ledge, he would land precisely within the pocket of opposing shadows we identified. To Pritchard, who watched from behind. The killer would appear to materialize suddenly from nothing, yet cast no shadow. To Hodges above, the fog at the archway would ripple as the man descended, but he would see no figure clearly. My mind reeled with the ingenuity of it. But Holmes, would not the fall from that height produce sound? Only a slight one, Holmes said, and masked easily by the ambient noise. Besides,
The man may not have dropped fully, merely slid down using his implement. The surface marks support that. Lestrade rubbed the bridge of his nose. This is plausible, Holmes, ingenious even, but how do we prove it? We need more than theory. That, Holmes replied calmly, is why we must next discover who possessed not only the motive, but the agility, nerve, and opportunity to execute such a feat. Before Lestrade could respond, a sharp voice called from behind us, "Mr. Holmes! Mr. Holmes, I beg your pardon!" We turned to see a breathless runner, a boy of perhaps 12 from Sir Julian's chambers, racing toward us. His cheeks were flushed, and he waved a sealed envelope in his hand. "Mr. Holmes, sir, Mr. Lestrade, Mr. B. Claypool sent me to bring this at once. It's something he found among Sir Julian's locked papers." Holmes took the envelope swiftly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the seal. Without ceremony, he broke it open and withdrew a single sheet of cream-coloured paper. For a moment, his face remained impassive. Then his eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest. "Watson, Lestrade, listen," he read aloud. "If you persist in your present course, the consequences will be fatal. There are matters in your possession which must not, under any circumstances, be revealed. You tread upon dangerous ground. Take warning." The note was unsigned. Lestrade's jaw tightened. "Well, that settles it. Someone meant him dead." Holmes folded the paper carefully. "Yes, but the phrasing is curious. It speaks of matters Sir Julian had in his possession. Not knowledge alone, but documents." "You think something was stolen from him?" I asked. "Or something he carried was the very reason for his death," Holmes replied. "It is even possible the murderer searched his body, or intended to, but was interrupted by Pritchard's cries." Lestrade turned sharply to the boy. "Claypool found nothing else?" "No, sir, only this. It was misfiled among older correspondence." Holmes tapped the envelope thoughtfully. "Lestrade, issue an inquiry at once regarding all cases Sir Julian was currently handling, particularly any involving political or financial consequence. And speak to his clerks again. There is one among them who knows more than he has yet said." Lestrade nodded and strode off with the boy. When they were gone, Holmes turned to me, lowering his voice. "Watson, we are dealing not merely with a clever assassin, but with a plot of some depth. Sir Julian carried secrets. Someone feared their revelation, someone agile enough to perch above an archway, bold enough to kill within feet of witnesses, planned his death with precision." "And our next step?" I asked. Holmes looked once more at the dark mouth of the Temple Court. "We must return to Baker Street. I have an experiment in mind, and when it succeeds, Watson, we shall know not only how the deed was done, but the very type of man capable of doing it." He began walking with swift determination. "And once we know the man," he added quietly, "we shall know where to find him." Holmes walked with such determined speed that I had to quicken my pace to keep beside him, though the afternoon fog had begun creeping upward from the river again. He seemed scarcely aware of it. His mind was entirely absorbed. When we reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had barely time to step aside before Holmes swept past her and into our sitting room, shrugging off his coat and reaching immediately for a coil of twine he kept in a drawer by the fireplace. "Watson," he said, handing me one end of the twine. "Stand by the wall, no, a little to the left, that will do."
He stretched the length taut between us, testing the tension with a practiced finger, then adjusted the angle of the line until it ran downward at a precise slant. Imagine this line as the arc taken by our murderer during his descent from the ledge above the court. The angle must match the one required for him to land where the shadows cancel here. He tapped the carpet with his toe. Now look at the slope. What does it suggest? I studied it carefully. It would require considerable upper body strength to lower oneself along such a trajectory. The descent must be controlled, too fast, and he would fall with a thud, too slow, and Sir Julian would have passed beyond reach. Holmes nodded. Just so. We are dealing with a man accustomed to climbing, perhaps athletics, perhaps something more specialized. And note the careful alignment. He would have had to study the lamps beforehand, test the shadows, gauge the timing. A man familiar with the location, I said. Someone who knew Chancery Lane well. Or someone who had reason to observe Sir Julian's habits for some time. Holmes added, The more I consider it, Watson, the more I am convinced this was no impulsive strike born of anger. It was premeditated, calculated.
Hurst. He released the twine and crossed swiftly to his desk, where he rifled through a stack of newspaper clippings Lestrade had brought earlier. He withdrew one and held it out to me. Sir Julian was counsel in a case 3 months ago, the Rollins forgery trial. Do you recall it? Vaguely, I remembered reading that Rollins, a sharp-tongued, volatile fellow, had been convicted of forging financial bonds to defraud a small banking house. Holmes flicked the clipping lightly. Rollins blamed Sir Julian for securing damning testimony. He made threats, quite publicly, during sentencing, but he has been in prison ever since. Also, Lestrade believes. You doubt it? I asked. I doubt any assumption which rests solely upon official complacency, Holmes said. But even if Rollins himself could not have done this,
consider the accomplices who fled England. There was talk of one, an agile climber, a former acrobat, who turned to burglary, a man called Victor Revel. The name stirred faint recognition. He was notorious for scaling buildings to escape pursuit, and equally adept at entering them, Holmes murmured. A man invisible until he chose to strike. He vanished after Rollins' arrest, last reported on the continent. Yet if Revel returned to London secretly, and if Sir Julian possessed documents that could imperil Rollins' associates, he might well have been commissioned to silence him. Before I could respond, a sharp rap sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, who looked more harried than ever. "I've just come from Sir Julian's chambers again, Mr. Holmes," he said. "And there's something strange. The clerk, Claypool, reports that a portfolio is missing from Sir Julian's private drawer. A leather folio containing notes on the Rollins case." Holmes' eyes glittered. "You are certain it was taken?" "As certain as we can be," Lestrade replied. "Claypool insists he saw it there 2 days ago. Now it's gone." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "Our theory gains weight, Watson." Lestrade scratched his head. "But if the murderer took the folio from Sir Julian's rooms before the attack, why kill him in Chancery Lane? Why not simply abscond?" Holmes raised a finger. "Two possibilities. First, Sir Julian kept additional documents on his person, documents the murderer feared he might reveal. Second, the murderer anticipated that Sir Julian, upon discovering the theft, would act. He needed to ensure silence." Lestrade grimaced. "It still leaves us with the problem of finding this Revel, if he is even in England." "He is in London," Holmes said softly. "Of that I am convinced. A man like him does not travel abroad for long. He prefers the intricate warrens of a city. And where better than London for a man who climbs like a cat and moves like a whisper?" Lestrade groaned. "If he is in London, Mr. Holmes, he's hidden well. There are no reports of burglaries matching his signature. Holmes smiled faintly. Not every acrobat-turned-criminal uses his skills for burglary alone. Tell me, Lestrade, have there been any incidents in the last fortnight involving unusual access to upper floors? Windows found open without signs of forced entry? Signboards or scaffoldings disturbed? Lestrade thought. There was something, yes. A jeweller's shop in Holborn found a back window ajar one morning, but nothing was taken. Holmes' face sharpened with interest. Ah, a practice run, perhaps. He may have tested his technique under different lighting conditions. Lestrade looked exasperated. Then you really believe Ravel did this? I believe, Holmes said gravely, that only someone possessing Ravel's particular talents could execute such a murder in such a fashion. But belief is not proof. We require evidence, and I know where to find it. He strode to the mantelpiece and retrieved his magnifying lens and a small metal clamp. Watson, Lestrade, we return once more to that archway in the Temple Court. There is a mark there, one which I examined briefly this morning. I aim to determine whether it is consistent with a rope burn. Lestrade blinked. A rope burn? Yes, Holmes said. If Ravel lowered himself using a rope, it would have pressed against the ledge or pipe. Even the lightest friction leaves residue. Within minutes we were again rattling through the fog toward the temple. When we arrived, Holmes directed us not to the lane, but directly into the court. He moved swiftly to the left wall where he had earlier shown me the faint patch of displaced dust. There, he whispered, kneeling to examine the stone. Watson, hold the lamp closer. I did so, and under the focused glow, Holmes's lens revealed a thin line, barely perceptible to the naked eye, of fibrous residue lodged in the stone's crevice. Jute, Holmes murmured triumphantly. From a rope, recently abraded. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Then he was above the archway, and descended over this very point, Holmes said.
The evidence confirms it. He rose, replacing the lens into his pocket. Gentlemen, the net tightens. Now that we know the murderer's method, we must uncover his motive and identity fully. The missing folio points to the Rollins affair. The method points to Ravel, but there is still something missing, something essential. What is that, Mr. Holmes? Lestrade asked. Holmes looked toward the entrance to the court, his eyes narrowing. The murderer planned his movements with precision, yet he slipped. Somewhere, however slightly, he left a trace not of method but of intent. Find the intent, and we find the man. And where do we search next? I asked. Holmes's answer was immediate. Where every professional killer leaves his first footprint, no matter how carefully he masks the rest. We must go to those who knew him before he vanished.
His old associates, his old haunts. He straightened. Tonight, Watson, Lestrade, we go to the underbelly of London, to the places where shadows gather most thickly, for there, I believe, Ravel waits. Lestrade stiffened. And if he does? Holmes's expression hardened. Then we must reach him before he strikes again, for I fear Sir Julian is not the only man whose silence he was paid to secure. Night had settled over London by the time Holmes declared the hour suitable for our next step, and a damp wind swept through Baker Street with a low, restless whistle. Holmes stood by the window, coat already on, his silhouette sharp against the lamplight as he surveyed the fog thickening over the city's darker quarter. When he finally turned toward me, I saw the unmistakable gleam in his eyes, the look that heralded a plunge into danger undertaken with calculated boldness. The underworld is more talkative at night, Watson, he said, fastening his collar. And if Victor Ravel is indeed in London, he will have chosen his refuge where men of his profession gather. Lestrade believes we are hunting a solitary assassin, but murderers of Ravel's caliber rarely act without financial incentive. Someone hired him, and that someone may be reckless enough to speak in the wrong company. I looked instinctively for my revolver, and Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Bring it, Watson, not because I expect trouble, but because our quarry is a desperate man skilled in the art of vanishing. He may not welcome interruption." We met Lestrade outside, beneath the weak gas lamp that flickered in the wind. The inspector carried a small notebook tucked inside his overcoat and wore an expression halfway between determination and reluctance. "I don't like you dragging us into the thieves' districts at this hour, Mr. Holmes," he muttered. "But if you've a mind to question Ravel's old associates, I suppose there's no avoiding it." His last known haunts were near Holborn and Clerkenwell, though the sort who knew him then aren't likely to open their mouths now. Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. "On the contrary, Lestrade, criminal loyalty is paper-thin when pressed by fear. Ravel is not beloved by his fellows. A man who works alone is resented for his independence and feared for his skill. If he has returned to London, someone will know it, and someone will betray him." We travelled on foot, for Holmes insisted a hansom would draw too much attention in certain streets. The farther we went, the narrower and meaner the lanes became. Gaslight gave way to the faint glow of tavern windows, and the fog thickened into swirling patches that clung to the brick walls like drifting veils. At last, Holmes turned sharply into a cramped alley, guided by nothing I could perceive but a sense of direction so uncanny I had ceased to question it. "This, Watson, is Barlow's Court," he murmured, "one of Ravel's former haunts." Lestrade made a face. "A vile place. Half the men who drink here are on our lists." "That is precisely why we are here," Holmes replied. The tavern within, the Cat and Lantern, was low-ceilinged, thick with smoke, and crowded with men whose red eyes and hunched shoulders told of lives lived by night and mischief. Holmes entered with complete calm, scanning the room with a single sweep that took in more details than most men would discern in an hour. He motioned for Lestrade and me to remain slightly behind him, then approached the bar. A burly landlord with a broken nose regarded us warily. Holmes leaned in just enough to speak without raising his voice. "We are seeking information regarding Victor Ravel." The landlord stiffened immediately. His eyes darted toward a corner of the room, then back. "Never heard of him," he said gruffly. "Now move along. We don't want trouble." Holmes smiled pleasantly, as though he had expected nothing else. "My good fellow, you are an excellent liar, far too quick, far too decisive, and with altogether too much tension in your shoulders. You have heard of him. You know more than you wish to say."
"And I suspect you have had someone inquiring after him recently." The landlord's jaw tightened. "You watch yourself." Holmes placed a coin, not large, but not insignificant, upon the counter. "A man such as Ravel brings danger with him. If he is near, you would do well to part with what little knowledge you possess." The landlord stared at the coin, then at Holmes, and his bravado faltered. "I can't say much. Don't want fingers pointed at me." Holmes lowered his voice further. "No names? Only facts?" The man swallowed hard and leaned close. "There was someone who asked after Ravel 2 nights ago, smartly dressed, didn't give a name. Said he had business with him, the sort of business that pays." "Did he say where Ravel might be found?" "No, but he seemed to think Ravel wasn't far, asked about rooftops in these parts."
"He was particular about vantage points. Said Ravel liked high places, practised from them." Holmes straightened slightly. "This man, did he give any indication of his station, his speech, his bearing?" The landlord hesitated. "He spoke like a gentleman, sir, Not a nobleman, but educated, sharp. Cold. Haven't seen his sort in here before. Holmes nodded thoughtfully and left another coin on the counter. As we turned away, Lestrade whispered, "So now it's two men we're hunting, the killer and the one who hired him." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured. "Or perhaps only one man who wishes to appear as two." He paused halfway to the door, suddenly alert. His gaze fixed on a narrow wooden staircase at the far end of the tavern. A shadow had moved there, quickly, silently. Holmes strode toward it with startling abruptness, and Lestrade and I hurried to follow. The staircase led to a cramped landing and a back exit into a crooked lane. Holmes pushed through the door and emerged just in time to see a dark figure vanish around the corner, fleet and soundless. "After him!" Holmes whispered fiercely. We ran. The figure darted through twisting passages with astonishing agility, always ahead, yet never quite beyond reach. Several times he seized drain pipes and swung himself around corners with acrobatic ease. "That's him," Holmes breathed. "Revel himself. He's been watching us." Lestrade's breath came in wheezes behind us. "Holmes! He'll lose us! Blast these alleys!" But Holmes pressed forward, relentless, his coat whipping behind him. At last we emerged into a small courtyard, ringed by high stone walls. The figure raced for a stack of crates, leapt, and seized the edge of a low roof with effortless grace. "Stop!" Lestrade shouted. For the briefest instant, the man turned his head. The gaslight caught only a sliver of his face, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes glittering like a fox's. Then he vanished onto the roof with a fluid motion that defied belief. Holmes stopped dead, chest rising and falling sharply. "No use," he said quietly. "He is as skilled as ever. Not even a constable's net could catch him in these heights." Lestrade swore under his breath. "He knows we're after him now." "And that," Holmes replied grimly, "is our greatest danger. A cornered Revel is twice as deadly." We stood in silence, the fog swirling through the empty courtyard. Holmes's face was set in a manner I had seldom seen, hard, focused, almost fierce. "He was watching us from the moment we entered the tavern," Holmes said, "which means he was expecting inquiry, which means he is connected not only to the murder, but to someone who fears we are closing in." Lestrade looked shaken. "He'll disappear again?" Holmes shook his head. "Not tonight. He has been hired for a task unfinished. Sir Julian's death was only the first step. There is another target." My heart tightened. "Holmes, you believe another life is in danger?" "I do. And if we do not uncover who stands next on Revel's list, that life will be taken as surely as Sir Julian's was." He turned sharply, his expression intense. "We must return to Baker Street. Tonight's encounter confirms Revel's presence beyond doubt, but we must now determine whom he was sent to silence next. And that, Watson, lies hidden in Sir Julian's missing folio." He quickened his pace into the fog, for the murderer has shown his hand. Now we must race him to his next victim. Our return to Baker Street was marked by a silence heavy with urgency. Even Lestrade, who normally filled any gap with speculation or grumbling, seemed struck by the grimness of our chase. Holmes walked ahead in long, swift strides, his coat whipping behind him as though propelled by the thoughts racing through his mind. When we reached our sitting room, he immediately swept aside the remnants of our earlier experiment and laid the half-burned fragment of Sir Julian's threatening letter upon the desk. "The key lies here," he said, tapping its edge. This fragment and the disappearance of the folio form two halves of a message. Sir Julian possessed information someone wished forever concealed. Revel was not hired to kill at random. He was sent to prevent disclosure. Lestrade sank into a chair. Then the next victim must be someone who knows what Sir Julian knew. Holmes nodded. Just so. The question is, who? He seated himself, fingers pressed steeple-like beneath his chin. His eyes closed for a moment, and the room grew still. It was always in these quiet interludes that Holmes's mind worked at its most furious pace. I watched the minute contractions at the corner of his brow, the slight movement of his lips, the faint tapping of his heel. At last, he opened his eyes. "We begin," he said, "with the Rollins forgery case. That is the thread tying Sir Julian's recent preoccupations to his murder." Lestrade straightened. "You think the folio contained evidence that could reopen the case?" Holmes shook his head. "More likely it contained notes pointing toward an accomplice who was never brought to justice, or perhaps a higher financier whose exposure would cause widespread scandal. Rollins was loud, reckless, and fond of drink. He was unlikely to be the true architect of the forgery scheme." I leaned forward. "Then Sir Julian may have been preparing to reveal the larger conspiracy." "That is precisely my thought, Watson." Holmes rose and paced before the fire. "Which suggests a second critical point. If Sir Julian feared for his safety, or suspected he was being watched, he may have confided in someone he trusted." "His clerk?" Lestrade ventured. "Perhaps, but more likely a colleague, a barrister of similar rank, or a judge with whom he shared professional confidence." Holmes stopped suddenly. "Who was the last colleague to see him alive?" Lestrade flipped through his notebook. "That would be Sir Edmund Tolliver. They dined together on the night of the murder." Holmes's eyes flashed. "And yet, Tolliver made no mention of any unusual behaviour." "Not to us, at least," Lestrade answered. "He said Sir Julian seemed in good spirits." Holmes snorted. "I rarely trust a man who claims another was in good spirits shortly before being murdered. It is a phrase too easily spoken, too ready-made. No, Sir Edmund Tolliver must be questioned again. I believe he knows more than he realizes." Before Holmes could reach for his coat, there came a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps in urgent succession. Mrs. St. Hudson ushered in a messenger boy carrying a sealed envelope marked with the crest of the temple. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the boy said, handing it over with a wary glance, as though aware the contents might bear some dark weight. Holmes broke the seal. His expression hardened. "It is from Sir Edmund Tolliver," he said. "He requests our presence at once. He claims to have remembered something of importance, something he fears may put him in danger." Lestrade leapt to his feet. "Danger! Then Revel—" "May already be hunting him," Holmes finished quietly. "We must go at once." Within minutes we were speeding toward the temple in a hansom that rocked perilously on the uneven stones. Fog clung to the streets in drifting layers, and the lamplight broke through in wavering halos that reminded me disconcertingly of the murder scene. Holmes leaned forward, gripping the rail with tense fingers. "Watson," he said without turning, "if Sir Edmund is the next target, Revel may already be watching him. We must enter with caution." When we reached the courtyard outside Sir Edmund Tolliver's chambers, all seemed eerily quiet. A single lamp burned above the entrance, casting a pale glow across the flagstones. Holmes raised a hand, stopping Lestrade as he reached for the doorbell. "Wait." He bent, fingers brushing the stone. Even before he straightened, I sensed his tension sharpen. "A footprint," he murmured. "Very faint, but unmistakable. Narrow light, placed upon the edge of the shadow." Lestrade's breath caught. "Revel." Holmes nodded grimly. "He has been here recently. Minutes ago, perhaps." He motioned for silence, then rapped softly on the chamber door. There was no response. Holmes's second knock was louder, sharper, still nothing. Lestrade stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes." The door. Holmes tried the handle. It yielded under his touch. "Unlocked," he whispered. "Either Sir Edmund left it so or someone else did." We entered cautiously. The air inside was heavy as though recently disturbed. A single lamp burned in the sitting room, illuminating papers scattered across the desk. Sir Edmund was nowhere in sight. Holmes moved quickly, scanning the room with swift, precise steps. "Lestrade, search the adjoining rooms. Watson, help me here." We separated, each moment laden with dread. I searched the study first. Empty. Then the corridor. Empty. When I returned to the sitting room, Holmes stood perfectly still, staring at the floor beside an overturned chair. "Watson," he said softly, "come here." I joined him and felt a chill run through me. A narrow smear of blood trailed beneath the leg of the chair. Not much, but enough. Lestrade reappeared in the doorway, breathless. "Holmes, Tolliver is gone. The bedchamber window is open. Looks like someone forced entry from the outside." Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though to steady his thoughts. "He has been taken," he said. "Revel has him." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Then we're too late." Holmes's eyes snapped open. "No, not yet. Revel is not a man of impulse. If he has taken Sir Edmund alive, it is because Sir Edmund knows something Revel must extract before silencing him. We have a window of time, slender but real." He turned toward the open window and leaned out, scanning the dark maze of rooftops beyond. "Watson, Lestrade, Revel will flee across the roofs. It is his signature. There are only 3 possible routes he could take from this chamber, and I know where 2 lead." He swung himself back inside with fierce resolve. "We are not chasing shadows tonight. We are chasing a man, and I mean to catch him." Lestrade stared. "Where do we go first?" Holmes' answer came without hesitation. "To the only place Revel would dare take a hostage, a place high, isolated, and familiar to him." He stepped back into the corridor. "The rooftops above Fleet Street. If he climbs there, he will seek an exit only a climber of his skill could attempt." Holmes strode toward the door, his voice low and urgent. "Come quickly, for every moment we delay,
Sir Edmund Tolliver's life hangs by a thread, and the hand holding the knife is growing impatient." Holmes led the way out of Tolliver's chambers with a swiftness that made Lestrade and me struggle to keep pace. The fog outside had thickened further, curling around the lamp posts and creeping into the narrow spaces between buildings like a living thing. Holmes paused only a moment in the courtyard, his eyes darting upward to the roofs that loomed faintly overhead. "Revel felt safe enough to descend here," he murmured, "which tells us he studied these rooftops well in advance. He chose his vantage points with care. If he fled with a captive, he will avoid the street entirely." Lestrade peered upward uneasily. "You're saying we have to go up there?" Holmes shot him a quick glance. "Unless you prefer to wait here until Sir Edmund's body is discovered, yes?" There was no more to be said. Holmes led us down a narrow side passage, then through a half-hidden gate that opened into an inner court belonging to one of the older inns of the temple. He seemed to know by intuition which staircases would be unlocked, which doors led upward rather than inward. And soon we found ourselves ascending a steep stone stair that spiraled toward the roof. At the top, Holmes tested the iron hatch. It lifted with a low groan, and a gust of cold night air swept over us as we emerged onto the flat rooftop of the chambers. The fog was thinner at this height, drifting in pale fragments that parted to reveal the dim glow of Fleet Street below. Chimneys rose like dark sentinels, and beyond them stretched a jagged landscape of sloped tiles, narrow gutters and precarious parapets. Holmes crouched immediately, examining the stone coping. Here, footprints, fresh. A light tread with the toe turned slightly inward. Revel. Lestrade bent close. You're sure it's not Tolliver? Holmes shook his head. Sir Edmund walks with a heavier step. These impressions are too shallow. Besides, see these smudges here, the faint drag of a man's weight over another's shoulder. My heart quickened. You believe Tolliver was carried? Yes, Watson. Revel moves faster alone. The burden slowed him, but only slightly, it seems. Holmes followed the footprints along the ledge, moving with astonishing assurance over spaces where the drop to the street was sheer and dizzying. We followed far more cautiously. After 10 yards,
the prints vanished at a point where the rooftop sloped sharply downward toward a lower building. He slid down here, Holmes said, using his gloved hands for balance. See the streaks on the tiles. The incline was steep, yet Holmes descended it without hesitation, gripping an exposed pipe for stability. Lestrade attempted the same, but nearly lost his footing. I caught his arm, though the rescue left both of us breathless and sweating. Holmes waited below, half shrouded by fog. "We must be quiet," he whispered. "Revel will hear any careless sound long before we see him." We pressed on, crossing to a second rooftop that offered a clearer view of Fleet Street. A faint glow from the shop windows reached the upper levels, and Holmes used it to trace another set of prints, this time accompanied by a mark that made him freeze. "Watson," he breathed, pointing. "Look here." I knelt beside him. The footprint was Revel's, but next to it lay the faintest impression of a heel dragging. "Tolliver resisted," Holmes whispered. "He tried to plant his foot, and Revel silenced him." Lestrade's jaw clenched. "Do you think he killed him already?" Holmes shook his head. "No, the blood smear in the chambers was shallow, likely a cut inflicted to compel obedience. If Revel had intended immediate death, he would not have burdened himself with the body." We continued along the rooftop's edge until Holmes raised a hand abruptly. "Stop! Do you hear that?" At first I heard nothing over the distant rumble of wheels and the murmur of Fleet Street, but then, from somewhere beyond the next ridge, came a faint metallic clink, irregular and soft. Lestrade whispered, "What is it?" Holmes's eyes shone. "A grapple hook shifting underweight. Revel is lowering something, or someone." He hurried forward in a crouch, and we followed until the rooftop dipped into a narrow trough between two gables. From this vantage, we saw a shadowy form crouched at the edge of the building, half shrouded in fog, a rope extended from his hands into the darkness below. Holmes inhaled sharply. "There! And the rope is taut. Tolliver is on the other end." Lestrade reached for his revolver, but Holmes seized his wrist. "No gunfire! If you alert him, he will cut the rope and flee." "Then what?" But Holmes had already moved. With a speed and boldness that startled even me, he advanced along the narrow ridge, keeping to the deeper shadows until he was no more than 15 feet behind the figure. The man was unmistakably Revel, lean, sinewy, with the poise of a panther. His movements were precise and graceful, even in the half-light, and though he worked quickly, there was nothing careless in the way he eased the rope downward. Holmes crept closer, and when he was within striking distance, he spoke in a low, razor-edged voice. "Victor Revel, release the rope and stand away from the edge." Revel froze. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, not even the fog. Then he turned his head slowly and I glimpsed the sharp profile we had seen in fleeting chase. "So," Ravel murmured, his voice cool and faintly amused. "The great Sherlock Holmes." Holmes did not blink. "If you release that rope, Tolliver dies. If you cut it, he dies. And if you attempt to run, I shall shoot." Lestrade lifted his revolver from behind me. "You heard the man." Ravel's dark eyes flickered, taking in the angle, the distance, the three of us positioned between him and any easy escape. Yet I sensed the man calculating still, measuring each option. "You cannot stop what has begun," Ravel said softly, "and you do not know whom you defy." Holmes stepped forward a single pace, every muscle poised. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you were hired to kill Sir Julian Ashcombe, and I know your employer wants Tolliver silenced next. Lower him safely, or this rooftop becomes your grave." For the first time, Ravel's mask cracked, not with fear, but with something like respect. "You are bold, Holmes," he murmured. Holmes's voice sharpened. "Lower him." Ravel's fingers twitched and the rope shifted. But whether he meant surrender or treachery, we never learned. For at that instant, a sharp cry rose from below, a man's cry cut short, and the rope jerked violently. Holmes lunged forward. "Watson, Lestrade, hold fast, he's dropping him." The rope went slack, and Sir Edmund Tolliver disappeared into the fog below. Holmes was already at the edge of the rooftop when the rope slipped from Ravel's grasp. His hand shot out, catching the frayed end before it fell entirely away. The force nearly pulled him forward into the abyss, and I lunged instinctively to seize his coat, bracing myself against the parapet as the rope jerked taut. "Holmes! Steady!" I gasped. Holmes' boots slid dangerously across the dew-slick tiles, but he dug in with fierce resolve. "Watson! Lestrade! Pull!" We heaved together, the rope burning against our palms, our muscles straining as though we fought the gravity of the whole city. For a dreadful moment,
I feared we were too late, that Tolliver's weight had plummeted beyond salvation. But gradually, incrementally, the rope began to respond. A faint groan rose through the fog. "He's alive," Holmes breathed. "Pull, Watson! Keep the line!" We strained with every ounce of strength we possessed. Inch by inch, the rope rose, dragging with it the limp form of Sir Edmund Tolliver, who emerged from the swirling fog like some ghastly apparition. His face was chalk white, eyes closed, hands bound at the wrists. Holmes reached down and grasped him beneath the arms, hauling him over the ledge with a final burst of effort. Tolliver collapsed onto the rooftop, unconscious but breathing. Lestrade knelt beside him at once. "He's alive, thank heaven, just stunned. I'll see to him." But Holmes did not spare another glance.
Even as we secured the shaken barrister, Holmes had spun toward the ridge where Ravel had stood. Ravel was gone. "He's fleeing across the east gable!" Holmes cried, already sprinting after him. I glanced once at Tolliver. Lestrade had him well in hand, then followed Holmes into the fog, my heart pounding as I scrambled over tiles and narrow ledges slick with dew. The chase was perilous. One misstep would have meant a fatal fall. Yet Holmes ran with startling assurance, guided by instinct and the faint whisper of movement ahead. We cleared one roof, then another. The fog swirled thickly, revealing only fleeting glimpses of our quarry. The silhouette of a man leaping a narrow gap, a hand gripping a chimney's edge, the flash of a dark coat vanishing over a ridge. "He's heading toward Fetter Lane," Holmes called back.
"We must cut him off. He'll descend into the alleys and vanish." But Ravel was far too skilled to be cornered easily. At the next roof's edge, the tiles pitched downward into a dizzying slope that fed into the upper stories of a printing house. Ravel slid down the incline with breathtaking agility, catching a jutting beam near the bottom and swinging himself onto a balcony below. Holmes did not hesitate. He followed with equal daring. I, less certain of my footing and far less eager to test the strength of London's architectural fringes, took a slower descent, gripping whatever protrusion I could find. Holmes had already reached the lower balcony by the time my boots found stable ground. From there, Ravel continued his escape, not across the roofs, but downward, leaping with cat-like precision to a window ledge, then to a drainage pipe.
Then finally to the alley floor far below. Holmes reached the edge, peering down. "Watson, he's heading east, quickly!" We raced down the nearest stairwell and burst into the alley just as Ravel's silhouette darted between two carts and disappeared toward a maze of narrow passages. Lestrade appeared moments later, breathless, supporting a weakened but conscious Sir Edmund Tolliver. "Holmes, is he—" "No time," Holmes barked. "Hand Tolliver to the constable at the corner, then follow." We plunged into the alleyway, guided by the faint slap of Ravel's boots against the stones. But the fog in this part of the city had thickened into a near-solid sheet, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. It was like chasing a phantom through the shifting depths of a dream. "Holmes!" I cried. "Do you see him?" Holmes raised a hand for silence. He crouched, fingertips brushing the ground. "Here! The prints! Deep, deliberate. He's tiring." I heard it then, a faint rasp of breath ahead, the whisper of movement against brick. Holmes surged forward, and we burst into a small enclosed yard, hemmed in by high walls, a dead end. Ravel stood in the centre, chest heaving, eyes bright with defiance. The fog coiled around him like a spectre, yet he appeared entirely fearless, even with Holmes closing in from one side and Lestrade from another. "Your skill has served you well, Ravel," Holmes said calmly, his breath steady despite the chase. "But even you cannot climb sheer brick without tools." Ravel smiled faintly. "Tools are everywhere to a man who understands the city." He lunged toward a stack of crates, intending to gain height, but Holmes was faster. In a bound that astonished even me, he seized the man's coat and wrenched him back. Ravel spun, striking out with a knife that flashed suddenly in his hand. "Holmes!" I shouted, but Holmes twisted aside, catching Ravel's wrist and driving it against the wall with such force that the blade clattered to the stones. Lestrade rushed forward, seizing Ravel's free arm, and together they forced the acrobat down until he lay pinned, helpless, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Holmes rose slowly, breathing hard. "Victor Ravel, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Julian Ashcombe and the attempted murder of Sir Edmund Tolliver." Ravel said nothing, but his eyes glittered with something between hatred and amusement. "You think you've stopped it," he whispered, "but you don't know what they fear. You don't know what he carried." Holmes crouched beside him. "Then enlighten us." Ravel only smiled. "You'll know soon enough." Lestrade secured the man in irons and signalled to the constables gathering at the alley's entrance. Ravel was dragged away, still wearing that unfathomable smile. Holmes stood very still for a moment, the fog curling about him as though the night itself paused to hear his thoughts. "Holmes," I said softly, "we have him. The murders—" "No, Watson," Holmes murmured. "This was merely the blade. The hand that wielded it remains concealed." He looked toward the temple, where the faint light of Sir Edmund's chambers glimmered. "And I fear," he added gravely, "that the papers Ravel stole, whatever truth they contain, point to a danger far larger than a single assassin." I felt a chill that did not come from the fog. "What danger, Holmes?" Holmes stepped into the street, his silhouette stark against the mist. "We shall know," he said quietly, "when Sir Edmund Tolliver tells us what Sir Julian dared to uncover, and why men were willing to kill to keep it hidden." And with that, Holmes walked toward the waiting constables, the fog swallowing him in a pale, swirling wave, yet leaving in its wake the unmistakable sense that the true mystery had only just begun. Holmes and I reached Baker Street just after dawn, the first pale hints of morning creeping through the fog. The events of the night, the rescue, the chase across the roofs, Ravel's arrest, hung in my mind like the fragments of some feverish dream. Yet Holmes, far from resting, remained alert and pensive, pacing before the hearth with the purposeful gait of a man whose thoughts ran faster than his feet. Lestrade arrived shortly after with the news that Sir Edmund Tolliver, though shaken, had insisted on seeing Holmes at once. We found him recovering in our sitting-room chair, wrapped in a blanket and fortified with a cup of strong tea. His face remained pale, but his voice had regained some steadiness. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "you saved my life last night. I owe you more than mere thanks, but I believe I now understand why I was targeted and why Julian Ashcombe was murdered before me." Holmes inclined his head. "Take your time, Sir Edmund. Every detail, no matter how small, may help." Tolliver set down his cup with trembling hands. 3 months ago, when Sir Julian prosecuted the Rollins forgery case, he began to suspect that Rollins was not the mastermind. He believed a powerful figure, someone with influence and access, had orchestrated the scheme, using Rollins and his accomplices as mere instruments. Holmes exchanged a quick, sharp glance with me. Tolliver continued, "Sir Julian confided only in me. He said he had discovered irregularities in the government bonds that Rollins had supposedly forged. The paper stock was genuine, issued from the Treasury itself. He suspected an insider." "A man within the Treasury?" I asked, startled. "Worse," Tolliver said gravely. "A high-ranking official who had recently risen to a position of trust. Sir Julian believed this man had facilitated the circulation of counterfeit bonds to cover a substantial embezzlement." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "A government scandal! If such a thing were exposed, the consequences would shake the nation," Holmes finished quietly. "Continue, Sir Edmund." "Sir Julian compiled evidence, a folio containing notes and financial trails, which pointed unmistakably to this official, but he feared his chambers were being watched, and so he divided his findings. Half he kept, the other half he entrusted to me." Holmes folded his arms. "And yesterday evening, did he attempt to contact you?" "Yes," Tolliver said. "He warned me that he had begun to receive threats. He asked to meet after dinner to combine our records, but before he arrived home, he was killed." "By Ravel," Lestrade murmured, "on the orders of whoever feared exposure." Holmes nodded. "The stolen folio then contains only part of the truth. The other half remained with you, Sir Edmund." Tolliver reached into his coat pocket and produced a thin, leather-bound packet. "Exactly. These are the documents Julian entrusted to me. I believe the two halves together identify the culprit beyond any doubt." Holmes accepted the packet with a solemn nod. "And the man is—" Tolliver's voice dropped. "Under-Secretary Gerald Haldane." Lestrade started. "Haldane? He's the rising star of the Treasury, well-respected, praised for reforms. Are you certain?" "I am, and so was Sir Julian." Holmes opened the packet and read swiftly, his eyes narrowing as the truth unfolded in the columns of figures, forged ledgers, and transcripts of discreet conversations. "This is conclusive," he said at last. "Haldane financed his private ventures by siphoning funds from dormant government accounts. When the imbalance threatened exposure, he coordinated the forgery scheme to mask his theft. Rollins produced false bonds under Haldane's instruction, and when the scheme collapsed, Haldane sought to erase every link to himself. "And now he has Revel to take the fall," Lestrade muttered. "He'll play innocent, claim he knows nothing." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "He will not enjoy that comfort for long." By mid-morning, Holmes, Lestrade and I arrived at Whitehall, where Under-Secretary Haldane was already beginning his official duties. He greeted us with a polished charm that barely concealed irritation. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes. What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Holmes did not waste a moment. "Sir, last night an assassin attempted to murder Sir Edmund Tolliver. That assassin has confessed to working under the instruction of a benefactor who sought to bury the truth about the Rollins case." Haldane's confident expression wavered. "This is absurd. I have nothing to do with—" Holmes laid the folio upon the desk. "Sir Julian's notes, correspondence between you and Rollins, records of false Treasury transfers. This, Under-Secretary Haldane, is the noose you fashioned for yourself." Haldane's face drained of colour. For a moment I thought he might attempt escape, but the room held too many witnesses, and Lestrade already stood between him and the door. All the bravado melted from his posture, replaced by a sagging resignation. "It was never meant to go so far," he whispered. "Rollins became reckless. Sir Julian, he left me no choice." Holmes's voice was quiet, but firm. "There is always a choice. You chose murder over accountability." Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Gerald Haldane, you are under arrest." The scandal that followed was one of the great sensations of London. Newspapers clamoured over the fall of a promising official, the exposure of government corruption, and the extraordinary role played by Holmes in unravelling the plot. Victor Revel, faced with overwhelming evidence and Holmes' unyielding deductions, confessed his part in the murders, though he never betrayed more than what was absolutely necessary. Sir Edmund Tolliver made a full recovery, and his gratitude toward Holmes remained steadfast. As for Holmes himself, he accepted all praise with his customary indifference, focusing instead on the finer details of the case long after the public lost interest. One evening, several weeks after the affair concluded, I found Holmes gazing thoughtfully into the fire, pipe between his fingers. "You are troubled, Holmes," I remarked. He exhaled a thin plume of smoke. "Not troubled, Watson. Merely reflective. Revel was but a blade wielded by a cunning hand. Haldane a mind undone by greed. Yet the true marvel lies in the fragility of secrecy. A single, overlooked footprint, a misplaced shadow, a scrap of paper nearly burned, and the entire edifice collapses." I smiled. "It is fortunate for London that you stand ready to catch such details." Holmes waved the compliment aside. "Nonsense. The world is full of clues, Watson. Most men simply refuse to see them." He rose, tapping out his pipe. "Come, my dear fellow, the Morning Post brings word of a disappearance in Sussex that promises to be intriguing. We must prepare." And as he reached for his coat and violin case, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation, knowing that wherever deduction beckoned, Holmes would follow, and I with him into mysteries yet unwritten. The case of the murderer who left no shadow was closed, but the dance of reason and crime, of darkness and revelation, would forever continue.